and things have learnt to walk that ought to crawl.
For context, this took place in 2007, and I was young, but even after all these years, I cannot figure out what the heck I saw. I truly have only told very few people because I fear them labeling me a nut. I am in upstate New York somewhere, and we were driving at night in a super rural town. There was a little town we drove around in often, so we knew our way around, and we knew shortcuts. On this night, we wanted to go to a party, and we chose to take a shortcut. Note, we were not inebriated at all. Ultimately, that was the goal of the night. This kind of messed those plans up. There was a small side street, and at there, you could turn left into a one-lane tunnel and cut to the main road. At the end of the street is a lettuce field which runs parallel to a visible train track behind it. There is a pole with a circular mirror pointing at the tracks, I assume for maintenance workers. This mirror is 10 feet off the ground. As we pull up to turn into the tunnel, we stopped a moment as we were just talking, and we looked forward towards the field. I don't know what happened honestly, but there was this tense silence and fear that came over us. And we saw this slouched creature almost squatting and just stared. At that point, it was crouched down and easily we could have thought it was maybe a deer or bear. But it turned its head, looked at the car, and its eyes widened in surprise. They reflected green like cat eyes, but huge. It stood up, and that's when we realized it had 2 legs, and we could see its shape. Someone whispered, "Turn the high beams on." And when we did, I was so afraid I couldn't even scream. It was very tall, easily 8 or 9 feet, but its spine was still visible as it was skinny, and it walked hunched over. You could even see its hip bones in its shadow. Thing is, it seemed terrified as we were. It took off straight and ran into the woods, so we went flying through the tunnel so we could get parallel and maybe catch another glimpse. But it was gone. Like we had scared it off. The whole drive ended. We went home. I tried to make jokes about it being anorexic Sasquatch or just hella drunk Shaquille O'Neal in a costume, but it didn't change the feeling we felt. Just absolutely shaken. It was like that moment of fear zapped energy from us. No, I did not check the time. I regret not checking the clock before and after. Has anybody ever heard of something like this? Now, this account is not my own, but was told to me by a Marine doing combat tours in Afghanistan. For the sake of his own job and security clearance, he has asked that I not give any names and never mention what region they were operating in. From my understanding, the individuals who were with him during the encounter were from a task force operating under orders for the CIA. Beyond that, I was told next to nothing. I will refer to him as Sarge, if only to have a name. Anyway, here's his story. During a patrol checking on some local farmers, Sarge's unit was made aware of a deadly being living in a cave system near their farms. When pushed for more information, the locals were only willing to say that this being was stealing from their farms and had killed a few people who had made the mistake of trying to protect their livelihood from it. Convinced the locals were being harassed by a group of Taliban fighters, half of Sarge's unit was sent out to investigate and either arrest or kill any hostile forces in the area. So, with a few Humvees armed with M2 machine guns, they went out to the cave where the mysterious being supposedly lived. Upon arrival, they noticed nothing of interest. There were signs that something was living in the cave, and the soldiers found animal bones scattered around the entry. Not wanting to risk his entire unit fighting in a cave that the enemy would know very well, Sarge sent his 2 fastest Marines to investigate. The 2 men just gave the others a cocky grin and a thumbs up before disappearing into the darkness beyond the mouth of the cave. For 10 minutes, there was nothing. Not a single sound inside or outside the cave, other than the idle chatter of the bored Marines. Then sound erupted from the cave, shouting and screaming. In a matter of seconds, the 2 men emerged from the cave at full run and zipped past their teammates. One of them shouting, "Run! Just run!" But like the hard-ass special forces operators they were, the other soldiers stood their ground, only to see a massive man emerge from the cave. He stood nearly 10 feet tall, with leathery skin and red hair. In one of its massive hands was a log that it began waving at the soldiers in a very obviously threatening manner. Shocked but not panicked, Sarge commanded his men to shoot, and the 12 Marines opened fire. But the bullets seemed to be doing little more than pissing this giant off. Finally, in desperation, one of them fired a grenade launcher at the being, blowing out a massive chunk of its flesh, exposing a small portion of the ribs and ripping most of the skin and muscle off. The giant retreated into the cave, and the soldiers decided that the best thing to do was to head back to the village and report to the rest of their unit. Clearly, this was more than a few Taliban militants. Even with the gaping wound, the giant was too terrifying for the Marines to willingly walk into its territory. So they headed back and reported to their CO. Of course, their boss didn't believe them and demanded to see proof. So that night, they drove him out to the cave and showed him some of the shredded flesh that had been blown off by the grenade launcher. From here, the report went up the chain, and nobody knows what was done about this creature. I wish he would have told me more, and maybe you guys can help me find an answer. From what I've managed to find on my own, accounts like this are not uncommon in that part of the Middle East. Of course, since all of these reports were word-of-mouth stories, I don't know how factual they are, or if they're being exaggerated. If anyone out there knows what this thing could have been, let me know. About 2 years ago, I lived in an old house outside of city limits in western Alabama. Wild hogs are considered a nuisance in this part of the country, and thus a year-round game. The land wasn't mine, but it was legal hunting ground, so my landlord gave me and my friends explicit permission to take care of any hogs we came across. So a lot of the time, especially during the winter when this encounter took place, I was posted up on my back porch with a cigar and a gun, either by myself or with company. This land wasn't very clear. In fact, we only had about 20 feet from the porch to the tree line. Then it would go down a hill and the brush would get thicker. So our hunting was just being quiet and looking for the beady eyes of hogs in the foliage when we heard rustling. So, all that being said, one night during my porch sitting, I heard some rustling. I started scanning the woods for this hog, and eventually did come across a set of white, beady eyes. They weren't hogs though, because these were eye level with me. As my eyes continued to adjust, the rest of the creature started coming into view. It was tall, thin, and had long, spindly arms and legs. Its entire body was completely black. I couldn't make out any other facial features besides the eyes. But what I could make out was that this thing was actually a good ways down the hill. So the fact that it was still eye level with me meant that it was likely around 10 feet tall. It started up the hill, moving towards me. I had this feeling in my gut that my .45 caliber bullets probably weren't going to do much here. So I slowly collected my things and headed back into the house. It didn't make any sound as it moved, other than the slight crunch of leaves. As it climbed the hill, it somewhat stopped at the tree line. It then turned and walked along the edge of it. It bobbed and lurched a bit as it walked, kind of how some large birds bob their heads as they move. That was the most terrified I had been in a long while. But this wasn't the only encounter. My hunting buddies and I all saw it several times, walking through the trees a good bit away from the house, sometimes turning to look at us. My roommate, that moved in later that same year, once walked outside and saw it right up against the porch, looking right down at her. It never tried to attack anyone, or even acted aggressively, so we eventually stopped being as scared, though still very cautious, and started calling him Big Boy. I've told a couple other friends about this. One of them said the description and behavior matched something called a California Dark Watcher. I did my research, and as much as this creature matches up, this was on the opposite end of the continent. I'm still not 100% sure what it was that I saw, but I'm 100% sure I saw it. Multiple people did. Update. Just spoke to my old roommate that saw it close up. She said that it was more eerie than downright scary. It looked at her like it was curious, tilting its head to the side like a dog when you're holding something at once. My hunting buddies and I all saw it from 30 to 50 feet away, but she ended up being closer than all of us. She confirmed no features other than eyes, but it had sunken in spaces on the face where there would be features. I understand her not taking a picture. I wouldn't take a picture of a bear if it was 10 feet from me, let alone this thing. I stumbled on this sub about 8 hours ago, and have went as far as I can with all the posts and comments, and that inspired me to tell a story of what I experienced about 4 to 5 years ago. I've told this story in a Facebook group about supernatural beings in Alaska, and I was mostly laughed at and criticized. So, if you're one of those types of people, please kindly just skip this story. So from the posts I've seen, you guys should be familiar with little people, right? I live in Alaska, so we have both little people and big people. We have our own native words for both of them, and there's countless stories about encounters with them. Big people are basically the same as small, but just taller. A long time ago, before photos were relevant in Alaska, my ancestors lived in harmony with the little people. Yes, they're next door neighbors and shit. They lived like that for a while, until one day, one of the dogs of the native people ate one of the little people's babies, as it had stumbled too close to the dog. Food was scarce to try and keep every single dog pack well fed. The little people leader met with the native leader and suggested that they put down the dog and all would be forgiven. Mind you, this was the native's finest dog and was the leader for many years, and he decided against it. Yes, I know it's kind of petty, and I will never understand why he couldn't sacrifice one dog, as great as he was, and try and craft another leader to keep peace between the peoples. As you'd imagine, both sides split up, and it's been that way ever since. It does fascinate me how life would be so much different if the native leader complied with the deal. I do wonder how it would be to live with them from time to time. Anyway, one winter night in cold-ass Alaska at around 5 a.m., I went outside to smoke a cigarette. It was unnervingly quiet and dark, as it usually is at that time of night. I live in a really, really small town that barely stretches across a mile long. Outside of my house, there's one LED light connected to an electric pole that's about a block or two away. There's never anyone out riding their machines or four-wheelers at that time of night, and rarely ever is someone walking around. let alone running. I'm smoking my cigarette, and about halfway through, I saw it at the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was someone taking a jog, but who would be jogging at 5 a.m. on a cold winter night? Not insulting my town, but no one runs here, not outside at least. There are some teachers who do run, but all the teachers were out of town, back with their families in the home state, as it was Christmas season. It was also snowing lightly. I turned to look, and oh hell, this 7-foot humanoid was just blasting down the street. I'm talking Usain Bolt shit, going for that gold. I'm not really great at height perception, but I know he was minimum 6'8" to 7 foot. But here's where it gets creepy. When you run, you move your arms, right? It's just instinct, and I believe it does help you go faster with the right form. When I saw it, both arms were tucked in at the sides of his hips. No arms moving, but those legs were going at least 20 to 25 miles per hour. Approximately 32 to 40 kilometers per hour. I was surprised at this point, but then I noticed something else it was doing. It watched me as it ran by. I can see the rough outlines at the top of its body, facing towards me the whole time it was in sight. No arms moving, only legs, looking at me as it burned through the road. Now, did I say there was a bright LED light a couple of blocks away from my house? And it faces towards my place, but that didn't do any help in trying to scope out its facial features, especially since the light was on the side as it was running, and completely on the other side of its face as it was looking towards me. I watched it go by as it watched me also. It felt like an eternity, but really, it was only about a 10 to 15 second encounter. Right behind it, a fox was chasing it, almost like it was its pet or something. Although it's widely known in the state, big and little people have supernatural powers, one of which is being able to transform into an animal it chooses. So I really don't know if that was its buddy or its pet. I'll never know. As soon as both of them were out of my sight, I went further onto the porch to see where they went. My friend, when I told him about that part, said, "Hey, what if it just turned around and ran towards you when you did that?" That made me realize how dumb I actually was trying to observe its whereabouts, and that I never in a million years would go further onto the porch just to see it again. After I saw it had gone, I couldn't fathom what I just saw until later. But I noped back inside. Even my cigarette was unfinished. I didn't even put it in the cigarette container, just flew it across the yard. I went inside, continued on like it never even happened, went to sleep and wouldn't talk about it for another year or so. I have no idea why. But when I did finally tell my said friend mentioned above, he immediately said the native word we have for tall people. A lot of my people choose to doubt me whenever I tell them about it, and it infuriates me because our culture has been involved with these kinds of beings for hundreds of years. We have a lot of folklore stories, but also we have a bunch of accounts based on true encounters. If you read up on supernatural beings in native Alaska, there are some horrific ones that will straight up scare the shit out of you. This happened a long time ago, and I do think of it time and time again. Like, why? Why did it do that to me of all people? I always heard stories of my friends running into little people, and I never did see them before. I would just be like, man, I wish I could run into a little person or something. Or something. I recall saying that a bunch of times. It's possible that one of their supernatural powers could sense this? Like almost mocking me. This is what you wanted to see, huh? I wouldn't go out to places at night unless I had a ride because who knows what it would do if I saw it again. This went on for about a year. Then I kind of just forgot about it, I guess. Nowadays, I can walk alone at night and be much less worrisome. I've done it countless times since then, and if it wanted to do something to me, it damn sure could have by now. People tell me that they choose who can see them and who can't. Their stealth is unmatched, and only a select few can see the big and little people. That's why I wonder, why me? Why did it choose to do that to me? Was it just to quench my thirst for the supernatural, telling me this is for real? I'll never know. I'm certainly not going to ask it. My grandpa was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his older brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At that time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched their sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Port Neuf River to ice skate. There were 8 kids altogether, and they were excited to show off their new skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brother, there were the 3 Robertson kids, Tommy Bayer, and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to the Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a couple of hours skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the riverbank opposite them. The kids could only watch as a giant man, covered head to toe in thick black fur, came lumbering out of the bushes. It was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleighs, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a good foothold because of the skates and fell back towards the ice. The giant was now crossing the river toward them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way. It only submerged its shins, but was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces of my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank and jumped onto the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant man was cresting the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there, hollering at the kids and swinging his tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to the Gooch ranch, where they told their encounter to John Gooch, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in the tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, there was found footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent in half like horseshoes. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any further. The creature was never sighted in that area again. The story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho wild man. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a ranch in a little lost river valley farther north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said that this encounter frightened him the most. He wasn't sure he would have been killed if the giant hadn't broken through the ice and given his brother a chance to cut his laces. G'day all. I'm looking to see if anyone has had a similar experience or may have an explanation for us. A bit of background information. This is my auntie's encounter from last night, 18th of June 2020, in New South Wales, Australia. It occurred at approximately 9:30 p.m. Earlier that day, she had driven past a motorcycle accident which had resulted in a fatality. My auntie, we'll call her Terry, has always been slightly psychic and has had several encounters with spirits and past family members throughout her life, but has never seen anything like this or experienced the sense of dread that came with it. Last night after work, Terry was driving home along a stretch of road that is surrounded by bushland on either side. Upon driving up over a slight hill, she saw a figure standing on the tree line, illuminated by her headlights. The figure immediately had her full attention, and a total sense of dread came over her entire body. She described it as a constricting bubble. This figure stood approximately 8 feet tall, had elongated limbs, was completely white, had no clothes, no genitals, and no face. The figure was directly facing her and turned to track the car as she drove past. Terry immediately began sobbing and called my mother, stating she had just seen a terrible, horrible thing on the side of the road. She drove down the same road today to find an explanation, but found nothing. It was almost a Slender Man type figure. We have spoken to a few people, and here are some of the explanations so far. One friend suggested that it may have been the victim of the crash earlier in the day, trying to leave Earth, but had become stuck on the way up. Another friend believes that it was some kind of guardian angel, sending her a sign of some kind. It is believed that angels may present themselves in a seriously striking form as a distraction to save or warn you of something. Maybe she was speeding and it stopped her from having an accident. I'd like to add that my auntie or myself are not religious at all, but all of our family has been baptized and finds comfort in the idea that there are people looking out for us. We would love to hear your thoughts and ideas on what she may have experienced. Cheers.
We don't get the kind of stuff down here that I see a lot of on this sub. A lot of it's Native American folklore I see here, which is creepy as hell, but I feel like our stuff is of a different world altogether. I've seen some stuff. A lot of it, we don't even know what to call. Our First Nation stories aren't as well documented as your Native American stories are, sadly. A lot of it got all but wiped out during the colonial years, and far beyond, come to think of it. But there are bits and pieces. There are voices that keep the old stories alive, and a few of them seem to tie in pretty neatly with what we saw that night. Me and my best mate, Gavin, we grew up together in Home Hill, one of the two townships either side of the mighty Burdekin River. You got Ayr, the bigger of the two towns on one side, and our sleepy little town on the other. We used to camp out a lot when we were growing up, but this was always done simply in our backyards, as we were too young to camp out for real. This all changed when we hit 15 years old. We were finally given the freedom to wander down to the riverside and have little overnight campouts. Now, of course, these excursions came with strict rules, as we lived in croc country. Where we live, it's basically where the Burdekin River meets the ocean, so strictly no swimming, no going near the water's edge, as well as the usual croc-safe stuff. Don't leave food out around your campsite. Set up camp well back from the water, etc. So, here we are, heading out for our first big camp out. Oh boy, did we feel like big men. All alone, nothing but our swags, a tent, and a few overnight supplies. Ready to tackle the big wide world. We followed all the rules though. We weren't silly. Growing up here, of course, you hear stories of croc attacks and, believe me, they are not pleasant. And in fact, they stand shoulder to shoulder with any supernatural monster I've read about. Fast forward to nighttime. We're settling into sleep. We're playing silly games, telling each other scary stories, just doing what young fellas do. When in the dead of the night, we pause. We pause because we hear something. A faint sound, but easily identifiable. A faint dragging. This caused us to bolt upright. There's only one thing around here making a sound like that. There's a croc dragging itself up the riverbank towards us. We shut off our torches and we huddled together towards the back of the tent. Gavin started feeling around for his pocket knife. We were planning to cut a hole in the back of the tent and make a run for it. We couldn't go out the front. It would be waiting right there for us. We would be running right into its jaws. The dragging sound continued. Gush, flop, gush, flop. Yeah, no doubt, that's a croc. With trembling hands, we continued fumbling around, looking for the pocket knife to make our escape. But we couldn't find it. That dragging sound was so close now, and we could hear the thing sniffing around. We could hear its guttural noises as it poked around our campsite. This was serious now. We were very much in a life or death situation. We had two options here. We could sit still and just hope that this thing doesn't smell us. Or we could try our luck running out the front tent flap. We tried desperately, ripping a hole in the tent with our bare hands, but we just couldn't do it. And the way this tent was built, we couldn't just lift it up and run out the back. We were trapped. Even if we wanted to consider running, honestly, we were frozen in place. I don't think that was ever gonna be an option. I don't know how long we sat frozen like that. I mean, it must have been a matter of less than a minute, but my God, let me tell you, it felt like much longer. Eventually, we heard a different kind of dragging sound, one that went on for much longer and was heading away from our campsite. The croc was dragging itself away. No, the crocodile was being dragged away. We could hear its jaws snapping. We could hear the sound of heavy footfalls. And then we heard the most disgusting sound of flesh tearing, ripping, innards spilling. Oh, it was horrible. Whatever was happening out there, we got the impression that we were now faced with something much worse than a croc. There was something out there, big enough to drag a crocodile and, by the sounds of things, kill it. We continued sitting there, just huddled at the back of that tent. And then there was silence. The animal stopped resisting, and we heard only the sound of a lifeless body falling helplessly to the ground. Then, silence yet again. Silence, until the sound of heavy footsteps once again reverberated through the still night air. I don't know what the hell we were thinking. We could have just sat there. We could hear the footsteps moving away. We should have stayed put. I don't know. Maybe we thought that because whatever this was had killed the croc, that it was somehow friendly. I don't know. We were stupid kids. We were panicked. We were in a state of shock. But, for whatever stupid, pig-headed reason, we slowly unzipped the flap and stuck out our heads. It was massive. I mean, massive. At least 8 foot tall. Probably bigger. Its limbs were not human. Nah, far from it. They were all cracked and broken and, honestly, looked like this whole thing's body was made of stone. It was lumbering away into the river. It was just walking through the water like it wasn't bothered. It dragged something in its hand, something long and sharp. I guess that's what mutilated our crocodile. Yeah, that's what else we saw. There certainly had been a croc, but not no more. This was no small specimen either. This crocodile, it must have been at least a 4-meter salty. Its lifeless body lay by the river's edge, a massive cut down its gut. There is nothing out here capable of doing that. Or so we thought. We watched in awe as this thing continued to wander off into the night. As it walked, it released these inhuman sounds. Grunts, grumbles. Those sounds still haunt me today. I have no doubt this thing was not a friend. It was out for blood. The attack, it was just too vicious, too deliberate. It was not there to lend us a hand. That crocodile just happened to be the easiest thing in its path. Maybe it noticed us. Maybe it knew we were in the tent and we were just too much of a hassle to get to. Maybe it didn't know. I don't know. Those questions, they do trouble me though, thinking back. The incident led me to look deeper into Aussie monster stories, to the point that I now have a pretty high level of confidence that what we saw was the Malingi. The First Nations people will tell you stories about him. They too know that he is not a friend. It's actually, at its roots, a bit of a bedtime story that they would use to scare the kids out of wandering off alone. But like all of their tales, it is deeply steeped in reality. Well, I know now for sure that this one is. I don't go to that spot anymore. Far as I'm concerned, that's his territory, and he can keep it. I do warn others about what we saw that night. Tried to tell our parents about what we saw. But of course, they brushed it off as a scared kid's imagination. I've not heard of any more attacks or run-ins with him, and I'm glad for that. I'd rather not be proven right on this one.
After reading all the anecdotes on here, I wanted to write down one of my own experiences that still freaks me out just thinking about it. Just down the road, from where a few years ago I had previously lived in Southeast Australia, is the opening into about 100 acres of woodlands and bush that I frequently went into when I was younger to do the usual things, riding and camping, etc. I was out driving at around 11:30 p.m. with my girlfriend, and as we were in the area, I decided to show her the woodlands, as she loves everything to do with nature and it was summer, so it was an extremely warm night. I left my car with the lights shining into the trees, as we weren't going too far in, and it was pitch black inside. The two of us just kind of sat, chatting, having a smoke and generally relaxing. She was sitting on a sort of a map of the area, and I was keeping an eye on the trees as I had a feeling that something was just wrong. I read on here a few people have said that they have felt that they were in danger, although nothing around them was off, and it was the same feeling. Every sense was almost reaching out, and my adrenaline was up, but there wasn't really anything in my eyeline that seemed any different. After lighting another cigarette to calm my nerves, I scanned the tree line again and realized that it looked different to before. It was only after staring into the dark that I saw that there was moonlight now, lighting up grass where it couldn't before, as there was a black shape blocking it, which before I thought was a tree. I've got goosebumps just typing this, but the only way to describe was that all sound just ceased and everything went dead silent. A few seconds later, this disgusting feeling of dread fell over me, and I saw motion in the dark of the path as this thing crawled towards us on all fours. I've seen nearly every animal in the outback here, and we don't have any large predators like in the US or Europe, but somehow I knew this thing was a predator, and it wasn't hiding itself from us but just slowly crawling forward towards us. I don't know if my girlfriend saw it or not, as I couldn't look away, but just as it reached the line my car lights were able to illuminate, it reared up onto two legs and just sat, staring at us. I'm 6'4", and this thing was about another meter larger than me, with arms that were far too long that reached down near the ground. All I could make out was an off-white, almost yellowish fur on it, and in the dim light could make out the silhouette of its head as like a dog or wolf. I wasn't able to move as it stared at me, but it was at this point my girlfriend gasped, which seemed to break whatever was stopping me from thinking logically. I grabbed her by the arm and sprinted to my car, slammed the doors and tore out of there as fast as I could, both of us too scared to speak until about half an hour later. We've both discussed it many times, and the feeling that we had was what I imagine a rabbit feels when it catches a wolf or fox looking at it. That this is something that would be able to end us with absolute ease if it chose. Neither of us have been able to come up with any explanation for what it was, but it has definitely changed the way I view the woods and bush. And when I go camping or hiking now, I think back to that and wonder what it was and if I will ever see anything like it again.
I've been all around Australia. Take my word for it, the best way to see this country is by car. There's just so many little hidden secrets and pockets of paradise you miss if you try to do it all by bus or simply jetting between the major cities. My memories of road tripping Australia are, for the most part, positive. Sure, there's been some ups and downs, but that's life, isn't it? You just keep on pushing forward. And that's what I did. There is one notable stopover that still stands out though. An event which very nearly convinced me to pack in my adventurous spirit for good. I will recount this as best I can. This was sometime around late September. I was headed from Barrage Bay up to Narooma. It's a gorgeous coastal drive for the most part, aside from one little detour inland as you pass Wallaga Lake. The best part of road tripping is the impulsivity, especially when you're driving a fully equipped camper van like me. You can pull in just about anywhere for a break, as long as the area you're pulling up at isn't illegal for camping and whatnot. And so I did, as I came around the bending roads of that beautiful lakeside drive. I found this picture-perfect spot to camp out for the night. Remote, peaceful, just the way I liked it. I set up my camp, got a hot pot of coffee going and kicked back in the deck chair, soaking up the sun. I got there right on sunset, so it was absolutely ideal. September can be a little bit warmer, but in the mornings and in the evenings that time of year, you won't find better weather down under. I was gazing out over the crystal clear blue waters when I heard someone speaking. They said. This startled me. It was not a language I recognized, and there was no one around. Well, there certainly was not a moment ago anyway. Again, that same voice. That's when I realized there was no one around. I was hearing this voice in my head. Bloody hell, I must be out of it. It has been a long drive. Louder this time, and sending shockwaves through my head. Every time it spoke out, it was like the kick of a bass drum reverberating from the inside of my brain. It hurt. That's when shit got real bizarre. 3 kids came tearing out of the bush, breaking the tree line right behind my camper. They were shouting at me, pointing to the road, screaming, "Go, go, leave now." The kids were clearly indigenous. Don't get the wrong idea, I don't mean some stereotypical image of indigenous Australian tribes living deep in the bush. They were just some local kids from a nearby camp. They sure seemed to know something I didn't though, and it didn't sound good. I decided that I'd best heed their advice. This, coupled with that weird voice, was giving me a bad feeling. I packed up my stuff and I scrambled back inside my camper. I strapped into the driver's seat, turned the engine over, and flicked on the high beams. As I did so, they shot straight into the dark bushland ahead and illuminated something massive. It was huge. I shit you not, 12 foot at the bare minimum. It had an almost spider-like appearance. Its arms and legs stuck straight out to the sides. Its face was pale white. You ever see those Slender Man stories? Kinda like him, but with a nasty look on his face. His eyes were beady and black, and its body, it was just like a shadowy mass. In my head, a voice, like before, but it said no words, just a low growl. The kids started bashing and kicking my camper now, but not as if they meant me harm or anything. They were urging me to leave. They screamed something out at me, a word I'll never forget. Dulagal. Dulagal. Again, that voice from before, but much louder this time, echoed through my head.
Awarananyi.
I watched as this thing slowly, yet deliberately, pivoted on its right foot and then began walking sideways towards my car. That was it. I was out. I stepped on the pedal and floored it down the highway. As I sped off down that road, I caught a glimpse of this abomination wobbling sideways, step by step. It was coming down the highway, following my car. Thankfully, for whatever reason, it did not appear capable of picking up any kind of speed, and I watched as it slowly disappeared into the darkness of the night. That was the first and last time that I've ever seen anything in my travels I would call otherworldly. I did not need to look very far for answers as to what I bore witness to that dark September night. A simple search for a single word those kids shouted at me turned up everything I needed to know. Dulagal. Straight out of Wikipedia, the Dulagal is a humanoid creature of Aboriginal dreamings. He is said to have bright, red eyes, and he stalks Mount Gulaga, walking sideways. See, where I was camped, it was a straight shot south from Mount Gulaga. So, I guess it fits. Why he was down by the lakeside when he's said to stalk the mountain, I don't know. Maybe he sees all this land surrounding the mountain as his territory. Maybe he was on the hunt. I don't know. The search did lead me to look into another phrase I heard that night. The words which constantly reverberated inside my mind. From what I could dig up, this is of the Gunyandi language, and it loosely translates to, "Please, go." What I can't figure out is whether this voice in my head was this Dulagal, or if it was something else. This Dulagal, it did not appear to have my best interest in mind. No, everything about its demeanour looked as though it meant me harm. The actions of the kids too, they were frantically urging me to get out. Like they knew if I stayed there, something bad would happen. If it weren't for them, maybe it would have. But nah, I don't reckon it was that Dulagal talking to me that night. He would have been quite happy to sneak right up on me. Still to this day, I can't shake that image of that awkward, sideways walk as he lumbered out from those trees.
Okay, so I live in Australia. It's currently autumn, and I live on the outskirts of a major city, still in the suburbs. This happened today in the late afternoon when I went to hang some washing on the line under our carport attached to the side of our house. We were starting to lose daylight, so I thought I'd quickly pop out and hang up the last of the washing for the day. It was increasingly getting darker by the minute. I had just begun hanging clothes when I started to get an uneasy feeling. I'm unsure why. I brushed it off as I was losing daylight quickly. A minute later, I heard a group of kids up the other end of the street, screaming, and then silence. Again, I brushed it off as the kids just being kids and playing with each other. The intensity of unease grew, and I felt like I was being watched. I then heard a low growl, which was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and the air got significantly colder, and all the crickets and bugs went silent. I moved the clothes rack to outside the carport so I could use what little light there was to hurry this up as much as possible. While hanging and scanning around between picking up the next piece of clothing, I noticed something new. This dense garden that wrapped around our U-shaped drive looked poor, like maybe it had been trampled in a decent section, maybe 13 feet of garden. I intensely felt I was really being watched by something, and right before finishing the clothes, the feeling started to ease off a little, and it began to warm back up, like it was when I initially came outside. I was raised with big dogs, Rottweilers, German Shepherds, etc., and grew up in rural countryside. I've heard all kinds of animal sounds, from wild dogs, foxes, koalas fighting, possums, and bats. I've never in my life heard a growl like this before. I don't know how to explain it, but it did not sound natural. It sounded closest to a dog, but something about it was very wrong. Before going outside, my indoor cat desperately wanted outside. Once I came inside, she was acting completely different, sulking around and all fur puffed up. She then was following me at my ankles around the house, which is not normal for her. We have a lot of bushland surrounding us and live next to a river, which is behind us. I don't fish in that river anymore, as I've always felt like something was around. I have a few more experiences. The first one is back in 2015 in December, around Christmas. My boyfriend at the time, now ex, invited my family to have a Christmas dinner at their house, and we were coming home after spending time there for quite a few hours. We both lived in small, separate, rural towns, and it took 25 minutes to drive, doing the speed limit of 100 km per hour to get to his. In between was nothing, except large acres of land owned mostly by farmers and the occasional house, but extremely spread out. This is your typical Aussie countryside, with overgrown dead tall grass lining the sides of the bitumen roads, filled with tall eucalyptus trees on both sides. Driving back in the dark, we automatically do 20 k's under the speed limit due to the wallabies and roos. They have a bad habit of darting across right in front of cars and blend in well with the tall dead grass. Instinctively, we continuously are scanning the sides of the road and paddocks to see if there was any wildlife we need to slow down or stop for. I was in the front passenger seat, closest to the side of the road, when it was pitch black and we were in the dead middle of nowhere at the halfway mark towards home. I saw this huge black animal, sort of running, kind of cross how a bear and a gorilla would run. This thing was keeping pace with our car, a big dual cab ute, doing 80 k's. It looked like a bear, crossed with something, but seriously deranged. When I fully looked at it, it looked straight at me, and its eyes glowed red. I let out what my mother described as a blood-curdling scream, and she reacted by slamming the brakes, thinking we were about to hit something. As she was nearly at a complete halt, she turned to me and asked, "What? What is it? What are we slowing down for?" I yelled at her out of panic. "Did you see that? Did you see that?" And then I yelled at her, "Don't stop, keep driving now." She started speeding up again, and at this point the thing had vanished, and I started telling her what I saw. She thought I was making it up, and thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, as in Australia we don't have bears or anything like what I saw. Years later I did some research, and turns out yowies have been reported to have red eyes when reflecting light, which shared a shocking resemblance to what I remember seeing that night. At least, I hope that is what I saw, and not something more sinister. Second experience. I was again coming back from spending a few days for Christmas with my now partner's family. I was driving back home. His family lived in a major city, and we still were living out in the country, so this was a 3-hour drive. Mostly 100k an hour roads, except for exiting through the city. About an hour and a half away from home, we were in the middle of nowhere, going up a tightly winding mountain range, thick with native forestry. My partner needed to take a leak, so the next dirt road I could find off the side I drove down. Most dirt roads are single lane, and here we move off onto the shoulder if someone is coming the opposite direction. But we were absolutely nowhere, and that chance was almost next to none. I was looking for a spot that I could pull over, but did not expect this dirt road to keep going and going and going. No houses in sight at all, and there hadn't been for a very long time prior to pulling into this road. After about 15 minutes, I find the only spot I could possibly park and pull a very tight U-turn and park up. We decide the area is lovely, surrounded by bushland and tall trees. It was afternoon, but still plenty of light, although the sun was starting to set. So we decided to kill the engine and hang out for a bit to enjoy the scenery. My partner finishes his business, and I step out to join him. We had been trying to start a family for a few months now, but it did not seem to be going well for us. We were both wanting some us time to take our minds off things and have a break from life. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, somewhere in the distance, we both hear a baby's crying. There were no houses, no people as far as the eye could see, and it sounded to be coming from the bushland. Only there was a steep, gradual decline down to the bushland off the road. We both verified what we had heard, and that we are hearing what we think we are. I worried initially about what if someone has dumped a baby, this area being so deserted. Then we both get an immense, sickening feeling of overwhelming fear and dread as the crying continues and gets significantly louder and closer within a few seconds. We both get in the car as quickly as humanly possible, and without losing traction, we get out of there as fast as I can safely. We both had an intense feeling in the pit of our stomachs that we should not be there and needed to get out. To add to the strangeness, turns out I found out 2 months later I was pregnant, and would have been pregnant at the time we had that experience. I would have reported the baby crying, but 1, no phone signal. 2, this road did not have a name and was not signed. And 3, there was no way someone could have gotten down there alive, also while carrying a baby. And there was no tracks, tire marks, footprints, zip, zilch, nothing. So before I start this post, I will say that I was very young, but my mother recalls the experience quite clearly. I'm not really into cryptozoology at all, but I'm curious if this is a common sighting, or what exactly my mother, father, and I experienced. This is along Route 66, going from Texas into New Mexico. We were heading to my great-grandfather's funeral back in 2005, in the middle of the summer, and I was 10 at the time. The sun was starting to set, and I remember us talking. I'm eating a Happy Meal they bought me at the time, and we were just swapping stories and having a good time. They made me this little cubby-like area in the trunk for me to lay down in, color, etc. But most of the trip was spent by looking out the window, watching things pass by. While my parents were talking and the radio was on, I was just watching the world pass by. But I remember very clearly seeing a man standing and staring at cars. He wore a black trench coat, bowler or perhaps a top hat, a black beard. But the part I remember the most vividly was the bright, glowing red eyes. I pointed it out to my mum, who was distracted at the time, having not seen it. Well, a couple of hours go by, and I'm still looking out the window. I made a little game for myself to see if I could count how many birds I could spot along the way, and the sun was starting to set. Next thing I know, I see the same dude just ahead of us. But because of the dark, the eyes were a lot more intense. My mum got a little concerned about it and told my dad to speed up. Eventually, fatigue set in, and we found a rest stop. It was pitch black in there, like the kind of dark you can't even see your own feet in without a light, and we were all trying to sleep. I had to go to the bathroom, and my dad walked out with me, as I was rather freaked out from the sighting earlier, worried the guy would come grab me. As we got out of the car, I remember my father staring off into the distance. He told me to hurry up, though keeping his usual calm demeanor. When I finished and got back into the car, he started it, and we took off again, driving to stay in a motel instead. I asked him and my mother about it recently as we were reminiscing together about trips we'd taken. When I asked my dad why he had us go to a motel, he claimed it was because he saw the same pair of eyes staring at us from a hill near where we were, above a rocky outcrop. Does anyone have any ideas or stories as to what exactly this could have been? I remember the eyes so vividly, it's burned into my mind, as well as him being out in the desert heat with a heavy trench coat, and I'm not sure. My dad swears it was the devil. My mum thinks it was a chupacabra of some sorts. I myself am not sure. Any thoughts would be appreciated. As I said, this was over 19 years ago, and I haven't seen anything since, as I live far away from Route 66 now. One night in 2013, I went over to my cousin's house when I was probably about 13 to 14 years old. This was in California. We were the same age and she had just moved in with her step-siblings and stepdad with her mum. They were in a transition moving period and her room was basically in the living room. The only thing separating it was a curtain. It was weird but not permanent. Me, her, Sav, and our other cousin, Trinity, were all at the kitchen table, talking about random stories. The living room and kitchen were all open. Sav's room was about 10 feet away from where we were. My cousin Sav at that time period was going through it really bad mentally. She kept having really bad sleep paralysis of these grey-looking people with greasy black hair, hugging her in her sleep and staring at her. I kept getting the feeling she had something attached to her. I've always been really spiritual, along with most of the women in my family. When I would bring it up to her, she'd get mad at me and tell me to drop it, so I did. But anyways, back to this night. It was probably about 7 p.m. and we had just ate some pizza. Me and Trinity were talking about whatever, and all of a sudden, all of the lights in the house shut off for probably 1 second and went back on again. We screamed in unison. No clue why, but I felt extremely compelled to look over to where my cousin Sav's room or curtain was, and I saw this 5'10" figure. Keep in mind, it's dark out, but not pitch black, and we had all the lights on where we were. We could see clear as day. I just remember the dead silence. I see this man and he seemed to have old 18 to 1900s brownish attire. He had a top hat on, but his skin was just grey. It looked like someone had made a clay figure with real clay, and it had human features, but I couldn't make out what I was looking at. I just had a pit in my stomach. Like this thing wanted me to know that it did not want me there. I was in awe, staring at it for probably 5 to 10 seconds in silence. All of a sudden, I was standing there, but all I could feel was disgust, anger, fear, basically any negative human emotion. It washed over me. After I snapped back to look at my cousins, they were both pale and in shock too. To this day, they still remember it, so I know I'm not crazy. We all described the same thing, and I wanted to get out of there. I damn near started crying because I felt so uncomfortable and weirded out, and called my mum to pick me up. But she would be about an hour or two to get me, as she was with friends, and we ended up watching movies, and I fell asleep. I just remember right before how scared I was I'd see it again. I never did. Years later, I met my boyfriend whose parents described seeing a clay-textured humanoid, all grey skin, and it was the same icky feeling. Has anyone else experienced seeing something like this? This was my most vivid paranormal experience, and seriously shook me. And when I think about it, I still cannot believe we all saw the same thing. Hand to God, this happened. Whatever it was, I saw it. My cousin had sleep paralysis dreams with the grey-skinned people, faces molded like clay, but not quite perfect. My boyfriend's family saw it. So strange. It was the 3rd day of February 2012 in the Brazilian state of Rio Grande. It happened several years ago. My sisters, my mother and me went to have some fun at some beach very far from our home. Our mother had rented the house of a friend for a few days, which we used while going to and coming back from the beach. It was one of those very dirty beaches where trash was dumped all around and not that many people were going to it. But for us, it was very fun. I even remember joking to my sister that there are probably sharks in this beach. It was pretty hot too, and I have the skin of a vampire, so after the first day on the beach, I was looking like Mr. Krabs and had to stay in that house while they went to have fun, which for me was okay. I'm kinda introverted anyway. One day, my mother and my sisters, all except for the youngest one, had to go to some specific place. One went to color their nails, the other went to have a massage, two decided to go back to the beach, and my mum was going to a club with her friends. My young sis went to sleep, and basically, it was just me in this 2-floor house which was way bigger than the home I was raised in. The place was kind of creepy, and it did not help that the moon that day was full. So I was a young and stupid child who was scared to hell by the creepy night and also full of energy. So I jumped over the fence of our house by climbing over it. My thoughts at the time were stupid. I was going to look for my mum. I did that without thinking about stuff like the possibility of me getting kidnapped or killed by some robber. This was Brazil after all. Street crime is high as hell here. Anyway, I walked a little bit around the town, but then realized I was lost. I was utterly overwhelmed by the samey modern buildings, and I had no idea where I was. I also had no idea where my mum was. I knew where she went, but I did not know where that was. After the fear of being lost fully took over, I decided to give up and go back to the house. But I did not know where the house was, so I walked around. There were very few people at night, and I was just too anxiety-filled to ask any who I saw for directions. Eventually the road mixed with this path of dirt. It sorta looked like the path in front of the house, so I thought it was the right direction, since I took another path after getting out of the house, but there were several others which this path could lead to. So I walked, and I found a beach. Not the beach where I went with my sisters, but a beach. But little me did not know that, so I ran into the beach because I thought that I could find two of my sisters there, and they could bring me back home. However, they were not on the beach, but something else was. This beach had those rocks leading up to outside the water. You know, those spiked rocks that normally sink ships. Yeah, those ones. And one of them was all the way into the sand. I kept seeing something moving beside it from the corner of my vision, so I just looked at the rock. Then, something came out from beside the rock. This thing, it seemed to be the size of an adult guy for me. It stood straight. It had legs and feet, but it wasn't human. And the biggest proof was a left arm. You know centipedes, those black things with 1,000 legs? Yeah, his left arm was like that. The thing extended to the ground and it moved, like it had a life of its own. I could see all the little legs moving. The whole body was weird, not just a centipede arm. You know that green guy from Nightmare Before Christmas? This man was kinda like that, but made of skin, with an egg-shaped head. I don't know what the man did after he saw me, because after seeing him in the clear moonlight with the ocean backdrop, my child self was absolutely terrified, and I just straight up bolted. I ran away as fast as I could from the beach, without looking back. Eventually, while running on the path of dirt, one of my sisters found me. It seemed like they were looking for me for a while. Once we got to the house, I got scolded to hell by my mother, who was angry as a devil with me for running away. She thought I would get kidnapped or something. I did tell this story to my sisters. Obviously, they found it to be unbelievable. In fact, the only one who believes in it is the youngest, but she also believes in all that witchcraft shit. So I guess her belief is already wonky. To be clear with you guys, I don't believe in supernatural stuff like werewolves, Bigfoot, greys, and all that stuff. I think all of it is a conspiracy theory and stupid beliefs based on zero proof. But to this day, I believe that man thing to be real. The memory is still very vivid in my mind. So when I was younger, I went to a summer camp on Wabamun Lake in Alberta, Canada. It's in the middle of the woods. Good spot. Anyways, when I got older, there was a separate few small cabins for the older kids. Up 127 steps. I know that because they made us count. Anyways, at the top to the right, there are trails to the other sites. And to the left, other cabins. 3 youth cabins on one side of the clearing, and on the other is one staff cabin. All of the cabins are on stilts that are approximately 3 to 3.5 feet in height. 1 door on the middle of the front, 2 windows on the front, 1 on either side of the door. 1 on either side in the middle of the building, which were behind 2 bunks, and 1 on the back, which was at the foot end of the rear bunk. There are 3 bunks laid widthwise on the left when you go in the door, and 2 laid lengthwise on the right with approximately 2 feet between them all. The side and back windows were in between bottom and top bunk height, but closer to the top bunks. However, the top of those windows were still 9 to 10 feet off the ground with the stilts on the bottom of the cabins. Also, there were shitty curtains that didn't cover the full window. I was on the first top bunk on the left side, with a full view of all the windows. We set up and leave for day 1. When we come back to pack up for the night, we all hop in bed and mess around like 13 to 14-year-olds do. Then, after all of that, before we decide to sleep, I have my flashlight pointed to the left of my cabin mate's head, which was closest to the right side window, feet to the front of the cabin, and we talk for a bit. When I notice at the top of the window, between the gap where the curtain doesn't cover the window, there is just something white, reflecting light back at me. And in my head, I don't really pick up that it's weird. Then I turn my eyes to it, and before I can focus on what it is, it darts out of the window and away from the cabin. And I just feel this primal sense of dread overwhelm me. I go apeshit, like a scared 13-year-old does. However, before I can calm down, my other cabin mate sees something in the top left corner of the back window and starts losing his shit as well. Once we calm down, and people are asking us what we saw. We both described the same thing. Something white that moved out of the way as we saw it, and scared us beyond belief for no reason. What messes with me to this day, however, is that it was on the top of the window. Therefore, whatever it was must have had to have been at least 9 to 10 feet tall. We did not see it again that night. On the second night, some of the other boys who thought we were just messing with them convinced us to go outside that night with them to look around and see if we can find it, which completely terrified myself and the other guy that had seen it. We're all looking with our flashlights about 60 feet down the trail near the cabin when, behind a tree, maybe 150 feet away from myself and 3 of my cabin mates, I see an extremely pale, lanky figure with what looked like antlers stride into the left diagonally away from us, extremely fast and absolutely silent. It had no visible hair either. All 4 of us ran as fast as our little legs could carry us back to the cabin, and once everyone was in, we locked the door and jumped in bed, all while losing our shit. A couple of us were crying from it. A counselor came to check on us to ask why we were being so damn loud. When we explained what had happened, he just thought we were messing with him, so he told us to go to sleep and stop being so loud. I didn't see it again that night, but a couple of others did. Same reaction pretty much as everyone else had. Nothing on the 3rd day, but on the 4th night, we heard screaming in the woods about a half hour after myself and the guy in the bunk beside me on the left saw it in the right side window at the same time. Nobody moved or went to check. We heard our counselor leave his cabin and look around for us with his flashlight for 2 minutes, and after he came to our cabin and looked inside. When he noticed that we were all inside and awake, the speed of the way his face went from anger to terror was almost instant. He just said, "Lock the door," before sprinting to his cabin and doing the same. The next morning we noticed scratches on the door of our cabin and his, which is strange because I didn't sleep for longer than maybe 2 hours that night, if that. Okay, so does that sound like anything to you guys? I've tried so hard to find an explanation to what this could have been, like a fleshgate or skinwalker, wendigo. I'm in Alberta, so I don't think it could have been a Fresno nightcrawler. Also, because when I saw it, it had arms, and Fresno nightcrawlers don't have arms. This happened when I was about 17 years old, 24 female, in northern Louisiana, USA. Even though it's been a while, lately, I keep thinking about it. Like, literally, I can't sleep because I just keep wondering if it really happened, and weirdly, I also have been wondering how he's doing. For extra context, I did not do any drugs this night. I'd been to dinner and movie with a friend, and we didn't drink either. Seriously, stone cold sober. So the story starts here. I met up with an old friend for dinner. It was a Saturday, early evening. We decided to go to a movie downtown. Downtown was usually not busy, but on Saturdays, you expect a bit more people than there were there. The movie theater is across from a public building with a bathroom that's extra nice, so we decided to go there first. It has loft apartments there, and I clocked a guy in the lobby just looking straight down at his phone. I clocked him because he's a man, and we're young girls. His build was probably about 5'10", if I had to guess, and he had a super regular body, not like fat or skinny, just super average guy. I couldn't really see his face, but I noticed him when we walked into the lobby from the bathroom, and he walked at a don't hold the door distance away from us, and also went to the movies. So me and my friend sit at the top middle seats for the movie. About 5 rows down was an older couple, and literally the rest of the room was just empty seats. He then comes in, still staring at his phone. It was so weird. You couldn't fully make out his face, even though his phone was bright. But of course, I wasn't trying to stare at this person, just wanted to not get kidnapped. He seemed close to our age, 19 to 22-ish, but you never know. So he comes and sits in our row, at the very far left end. Arguably, a pretty terrible spot choice, with so many options available. He proceeds to stare at his phone, brightness on full, for the entire length of the movie. I was a little nosy at this point, sue me, but I looked over at him from time to time throughout the film, just glancing to see what was so important on his phone because it was bright, and I don't know, this situation was weird. It was a bright white screen, and he wasn't clicking or playing or doing anything but just holding his phone. And I don't know, that's just actually it. So movie ends, we go to leave. I'm holding the door open for the older couple. He's behind them, so I decided to stay, holding the door. As he gets closer, he looks up at me, so I smiled at him and his face looked regular at first. Pretty attractive actually. But when he smiled, his smile changed very quickly into his whole face. Like it was such a huge smile, it did not feel real at all. Not like a creepy movie way, or someone with a big mouth, but not like a human. And his eyes flashed. I don't know, but they were just different. I guess my face looked immediately shocked, because then his eyes went back to normal, and he looked normal, but his facial expression was like he was embarrassed or caught out, and he looked back down at his phone and continued to walk past me through the door. So I followed him as he walked around me, meaning I did a 270 turn around to watch him walk away, and by the time I'd spun around, he was actually literally gone. I'm saying he was very close to me walking by, and I spun while he was walking. And also, we were in a fairly quiet downtown. Even if this man started running away, there was no alley to run down, and I just would have seen him running or walking. I even walked out a ways to see if he hid behind a parked car, which there was like only 2. There's actually more. If anyone wanted to know, he was dressed in a white shirt, denim jeans, denim jacket, and had medium brown hair. His skin was not super pale, just like medium, regular white guy skin tone. There's more though, so I snapped back to reality, thinking that was insane. Am I crazy? Also, I need to drive my friend back to her car. So we leave, I drop her off, and then I head home. About my drive home, the last 7 minutes of my drive is a flat highway. Speed limit is 55, trees on either side with some breaks in between. There is a larger area before turning into my neighborhood. There are 2-ish lights to the right side that are red and white. I don't know what they are, just airplane towers or something. They are always there. I know where. I recognize them. Okay, so I'm on that last stretch, and just before, I was noticing that it really is a super calm, quiet Saturday. Like there were no cars passing by, and it was pretty still outside. Around the 7th minute zone, I see this big white ball of light up by my neighborhood, seeming like in the middle of the road. So I kept driving, being like, what is that? As I got closer, it seemed that it was pretty close to the road, but actually it was above it. I mean, directly above the street, not in the field to the right where those poles are in the distance. As I pulled up to the left turn into the neighborhood, I just parked. there was this massive aircraft just silently hovering above the road, about the height of the pine trees maybe. Not near the trees though. The trees are more in my neighborhood. I just stared at it, mouth open probably. I could only see the undercarriage of it, and it looked like an isosceles triangle, and seemed to have sheet metal panel looking things. I'd have to imagine that's not what it was, but that's what it looked like, with little dots where I imagine bolts to be. It felt like he was in it. Okay, so I know it was 11ish when I left the theater, and maybe 11:55 to 12:05 when I got home. It's about a 30-minute drive to my house, so I must have sat there for a good little bit just staring. No wind or noise. I finally decided to turn into my neighborhood. It moved to the left of my neighborhood and stayed just outside of the tree line. The only way I can describe the movement would be like gliding. Once at the tree line, it just moved slowly, like it was just wanting to watch me drive the rest of the way home, or some particular interest. Actually, when I got home, I got out of my car and looked through the trees. I can see the white and red towers that are always there, and then this white light right where it was, by the tree line before I went too deep into the neighborhood. It stayed there. I finally went inside around 12:15, and I just ran to my parents and was like, what type of plane can make no wind or sound that might do testing here? Like, we literally started Googling. Couldn't figure it out. Went to bed. Felt like I was being watched all night and for several days after that. Checked the next night, and there was no light except the ones that are always there. And every so often since then, I've thought of him. I feel bad if I hurt him by the reaction on my face. Anyway, any info about this or other similar encounters is much appreciated. I don't know what I'm trying to do, but I just can't sleep because I keep wondering if I'm insane, if it really happened. It feels like I'm supposed to not remember it, or maybe it's just starting to fade. But I have doubts until I run through the story again, and I'm just like, no, I saw it. It was wild, you know? Anyway, thank you. If you listened this far, I appreciate you. And again, any info is helpful. Thanks. I live on about 2,000 acres of farmland in southern Michigan, with scattered wooded areas all around. When I was younger, around 12 to 15, I loved the art of bushcraft, simply building forts, fires, and hanging out in the woods. I never feared anything out there because I had nothing to fear, but somehow that seemed to have changed overnight. I suddenly felt watched or followed whenever I went out in the woods after school or on the weekends. I'd look over my shoulder every 5 seconds, it felt like. The last time I ever remember playing in the woods, I mustered up the courage to go out and just have fun, build a new fort, start a fire and toast some bread, and warm up a can of chili and go home, which was in sight but about a half-mile walk through the recently harvested fields. The feeling of being watched subsided, but with that came an overwhelming feeling that I was being stalked. I tried rationalizing that it's common to feel that way in the woods with the wildlife and all. I decided to start a fire just to get it going for when it was time to eat. I tried not to venture far for fallen trees and brush. I started setting up my camp. Sitting on a fallen tree while cutting a groove into a large branch to make it fit easier on another, I started hearing what sounded like scratching on a tree. I looked up from my task into the thick tree line, and with branches full of leaves, I couldn't see anything, so I thought it was a raccoon digging its new home in a stump. My camp was nearly complete in the early evening. I just need to throw brush on the tarp and I'd go home after I eat. I heard the scratching again as soon as I tried opening my can of chili, and through the thick pine branches, about 20 to 25 yards, I saw a dark-haired thing reaching around the tree, hiding everything but its right arm and half of its face, which looked human, but also like a dog, white in its eyes with what looked like a grin on its face. I don't think I've ever moved as fast as I did in that moment, throwing dirt that was next to the fire on it and booking it into the field, leaving behind my food and my bag of tools and such. Before making the half-mile run home, I have no idea what possessed me to look back into the trees, but I saw this creature doing the same thing to a tree on the tree line. Same distance between us. Only thing different from last time is that though I could only see half its face, whatever it was, it looked pissed, slowly hiding completely behind the tree. I took off for home, not stopping the entire run. To my knowledge, my little bag with my tools in it are still in those woods. It's been nearly 10 years since it happened, but I still refuse to go back into that specific wooded area, as it's the densest and largest one on the property. I've always been one to take the long way home from wherever I'm coming from, back roads or take the highway a little out of the ways. I like driving, especially at night. Heat turned up, soft chill music, and the night sky to relax me from my busy social life. In 2021, I drove around 45 minutes to see my friends about twice a week. I'd never stay the night. I'd just stay late and take the drive home around 2, 3, sometimes 4 a.m. When it comes to driving, I'm wide awake. My music and thoughts keep me awake. I don't drive if I'm the slightest bit tired. Anyone from South and Southeastern Michigan can tell you the weather in early 2021 was nasty. Cold, wet, and thick snow and ice like Mother Nature said, "I told you I could." Despite these conditions, I still went and visited these friends. So I carefully drive to and from wherever I went to see them. With these conditions came an alternate route to get home to avoid most traffic. Not like there was any most of the time, but to be even more safe. It required me taking the highway about 10 to 15 more minutes west into a small city, getting off and cutting through the downtown area onto the old US highway. Just a simple main road. Tacked on about an extra 15 to 20 minutes sometimes, but I was never in a rush and this was safer. I took this route from then until my friends moved away, so about 3 to 4 months. It was relaxing until one night, towards the time my friends moved away, I was about 8 to 10 minutes away from home. Along this main road, there were obviously back roads that came into an intersection where I have the right of way or the sideways T for the back road to enter the main road. In this case, it was like a hidden driveway because the thick tree line was just 5 feet off the shoulder on the road. This road led over a highway, around a lake, and back over to the main road I was in. I started experiencing a feeling of confusion and kind of like dread when I started approaching this road. Even though I drive by it and don't have to turn into it, I still felt scared, in a sense, to come across it, and that feeling would suddenly stop as soon as I passed it and went over the hill. One night I was doing my regular long way home drive, and I got the feeling again. I could chalk these experiences up to sleep deprivation and hallucinations of exhaustion, but I don't ever remember being tired enough to feel that way. That's when I noticed the same creature I saw when I was younger, playing in the woods, was hiding behind a tree 5 feet off the shoulder, eyeing me down with half its face behind the tree and its right arm wrapped around the trunk. The snow on the ground and clear moonlit sky made it clearly visible. This wasn't a small critter crawling up the tree or someone messing with me. This was the dog humanoid-like creature I saw when I was younger. I probably went 80 miles per hour all the way home despite the ice after seeing that, running straight out of my car into the house and into my room. This happened another 3 to 4 times on different trees along that tree line, until I stopped taking that way home. It's a normal route for me now during the day, but I always try avoiding it at night now, until just last year, at the end of summer. In the summer of 2022, I'd visit a different friend in said town I'd cut through to make it home for my other friends in Story 2. She lived right off the highway exit I'd take in Story 2. Just a left to her place, rather than originally going right to cut through downtown and home. I almost forgot about my previous experiences. I'd stay the night at this friend's place and go home around 5 to 6 a.m. And I'd take that same back road home because it's the only main one, and the highway I had to take south to home was too far out of the way. Plus, I would be well rested, enough so to watch out for deer. I never experienced that creature on the shoulder of the road again, since 2021, but I told myself it was all sleep deprivation, and I never get that feeling anymore, so I was obviously hallucinating. To prove it to myself one morning, I'd take that road where that creature would hide in the tree line on the shoulder, and would wrap around the lake and back to the main road just to prove to myself that it was all hallucinating or just scaring myself. After taking the right turn down the side road and going over the highway and around a bend, you're met with a hilly dirt road that's meant for 2 cars to go down, but only feels like 1 car can. Trees hug both sides of the road and over it like a canopy, with about 3 houses scattered down the right side, one about every half mile on a 1.5 to 2 mile road. So, a not very populated back road. I made my way down the road, feeling hard-headed and relaxed. I made it about 2/3 of the way. I can see the stop sign I'm supposed to take a left at, that leads back to the main road with the final ranch-style home on my right, and the thick trees stop into individually spaced out trees every 10 feet. The last tree before the thick tree line started back up, I saw those damn glowing white eyes behind the trunk of the tree. Involuntarily, pressing my gas pedal faster and faster, this thing, this tormenting beast, just eyes me down, turning to continuously stay hidden, showing nothing but its face. My headlights are LED, so I got the best look possible, especially with dawn's sunlight peeking out through the trees right on it. Dog-like is the best way I can describe it, with humanoid-like capabilities, as to stand on 2 feet and maneuver around a tree like that so smoothly. I don't know what this thing is, but from what I've listened to and researched, as I'm a big paranormal encrypted fan, I've come to the conclusion that it's a Hidebehind. I haven't told these stories to anyone, as to ruin people's perspective of me like I'm crazy. I rationalize it with the belief that I could be hallucinating, but that just seems like more of an excuse now that I've seen it with my own well-rested eyes in the early morning. It's almost like it's stalked me all of these years, and though I haven't seen it in over a year, I like to think that it's done with me. Or does that just mean I'm overdue for another encounter? I've always enjoyed solo camping trips. There's something incredibly freeing about being alone in nature, with only the sounds of the forest for company. Last summer, I decided to venture into the remote woods of northern Minnesota for a few days of solitude and reflection. The first couple of days were great. The weather was perfect, and I spent my time hiking, fishing, and relaxing by the campfire. The isolation was exactly what I needed to clear my mind and recharge. But on the third day, something happened that I still can't quite explain. I'd set up my camp near a small clearing, with my tent nestled between a few large trees. As evening began to fall, I realized I needed more firewood to keep the campfire going through the night. I grabbed my hatchet and ventured a bit further into the forest to gather some wood. As I walked, I felt a slight unease, but chalked it up to the natural eeriness of the forest at dusk. The shadows were growing longer, and the forest seemed to grow quieter with each step I took. I kept an eye out for suitable branches and downed trees, focused on my task. That's when I first saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadowy figure seemed to flit behind a tree. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. I laughed nervously to myself, dismissing it as a trick of the light or my imagination playing with the changing shadows. I continued deeper into the woods, collecting a decent pile of firewood. As I bent down to pick up another piece, I heard the distinct snap of a twig. I stood up and scanned the area. About 30 feet away, almost entirely obscured by the trees, was part of a dark figure. When I say part, I mean only half a face and one of its long arms. It was tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows cast by the trees. It just stood there, watching me. My heart raced. I tried to convince myself that it was just a product of my mind playing tricks in the fading light. But every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. I stepped back slowly, never taking my eyes off the figure. As I moved, it mirrored my actions, staying hidden behind the thick tree trunks. I quickly gathered my firewood and started the trek back to my campsite, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. But every few steps I would glance back and catch a glimpse of the figure following me, always just out of clear view, always just half of its face peering from behind a tree. It felt like a game of cat and mouse, and I was the prey. By the time I reached my campsite, the light had almost completely faded. I hastily got the fire going again, the comforting flames casting long shadows around my camp. I hoped the fire would deter whatever it was, but the feeling of being watched never faded. That night I barely slept. Every crackle of the fire and rustle of the leaves outside my tent kept me on edge. I clutched my hatchet tightly, ready for anything. At some point during the night, I thought I heard footsteps just outside of my tent. But when I listened harder, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees. The next morning, I wasted no time packing up my campsite. The sense of dread from the previous night still clung to me, urging me to leave. As I was making my way back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, though I saw no sign of the figure again. It wasn't until years later, while drinking one night and sharing creepy camping stories with my friends, that one of them mentioned the legend of the Hidebehind. According to folklore, it's a creature that stalks and preys on people in the woods, always staying just out of clear sight. The description matched my experience perfectly. Had I been stalked by a Hidebehind that night in the Minnesota woods? To this day, I can't be sure, but I often find myself thinking back to those eerie moments, wondering if there's some truth to the old legends. When I was 11 years old, my family decided to rent a secluded cabin in the woods of Wisconsin for our summer vacation. The idea was to disconnect from our busy lives and spend some quality time together in nature. We'd go fishing, hiking, and just enjoy the tranquility of the great outdoors. On the surface, the cabin was perfect. It was quaint, cozy, and surrounded by dense woods. The first few days were a dream. My parents and I would venture into the woods during the day and in the evenings, we would sit by the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. However, things started to change about halfway through our stay. It began with fleeting shadows. I'd be playing outside or gazing out the cabin window when I'd catch a glimpse of something dark and tall darting behind a tree. The first few times I thought it was just my imagination. I was a kid after all. But it wasn't just me. My mum mentioned seeing something strange too. She would catch what she described as a tall shadow moving swiftly through the trees, always just out of sight. My dad dismissed it as wildlife, probably a deer or some other animal native to the area. One evening, while my parents were inside preparing dinner, I decided to explore a bit deeper into the woods. I wasn't too far from the cabin when I heard a twig snap. Startled, I looked around and saw it, a dark figure peeking from behind a tree. It was thin, with long limbs, mostly hidden by shadows. I froze. The figure seemed to be watching me. My heart was racing and I could barely breathe. Then, in an instant, it slipped behind the tree out of sight. Terrified, I ran back to the cabin as fast as my legs could carry me. I burst inside, trying to explain to my parents what I had seen. They attributed it to my imagination and the creepiness of the woods as it got darker. But I knew what I saw was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle outside the cabin made me jump. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. At one point, curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked out the window. My heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the clearing, was the figure again. It was closer than before, almost as if it had been slowly inching its way toward the cabin over the past few days. I woke my parents, but by the time they looked, it was gone. Our vacation, which had started with so much joy, became a tense affair. The feeling of being watched grew stronger every day. My mum started seeing those shadows more frequently too. My dad, ever the skeptic, tried to ignore it, but I could see the unease in his eyes. On the last night of our stay, the tension reached its peak. We were gathered in the living room, playing a board game, Monopoly if I recall correctly, trying to distract ourselves, when there was a loud knock on the window. We all jumped. My dad grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the window. There was nothing there. He stepped outside to check, but found no signs of anyone or anything. Reluctantly, we decided to call it a night. I woke up in the middle of the night to an eerie silence. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I tiptoed to the window and looked out once more. There it was, the dark figure, peering from behind a tree, motionless at the tree line, its hollow eyes seemingly fixed on me. I hurried back to bed and hid under the covers, willing myself to fall asleep and for morning to come quickly. We left the cabin the next day, cutting our vacation short. My parents didn't say much about the strange occurrences, but I knew they felt the same unease I did. Years later, as an adult, I recounted this story to a friend, expecting them to laugh it off as a child's overactive imagination. But instead, their expression grew serious. They told me about a cryptid called a Hidebehind, known for lurking in forests and hiding behind trees. Chills ran down my spine. All these years, I had no name for what I saw, but hearing about the Hidebehind matched perfectly with the unexplainable shadows and figures I remembered. So I'm left wondering, was it really a Hidebehind that haunted our vacation in Wisconsin? What do you think? So my boyfriend, Matt, is an avid hiker. He's been hiking for years and loves the outdoors. Me, not so much. But because I love him and want to share his interests, I've been trying to get into it. This was only our third hike together, a trip planned from Cadillac to Manistee through the Manistee National Forest. As someone relatively new to hiking, I was looking forward to the scenic views and some quality time with Matt. The first couple of days were amazing. The forest was beautiful, the weather was perfect, and I was starting to see why Matt loved this so much. But by the third day, things took a turn. We were deep in the forest, away from any signs of civilization. It was late afternoon when I first noticed something odd. I kept seeing movements out of the corner of my eye, just fleeting shadows that disappeared the moment I turned to look. I chalked it up to my inexperience and tiredness. But there was this moment when we were taking a break, and I saw it again, a dark figure darting behind a tree. I mentioned it to Matt, and he reassured me that it was probably just an animal and nothing to worry about. As we continued hiking, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake off the sensation, and the glimpses of the figure became more frequent. At one point, while Matt was adjusting his backpack, I felt compelled to look behind us. That's when I saw what I'm sure was a face peeking out from behind a tree. It was just for a split second, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. That night we set up camp by a small clearing. While Matt was making dinner, I wandered a bit to collect some firewood. That's when I had my first real encounter. I was about 20 feet from our campsite when I heard a twig snap. I turned around and saw it. The same figure, but this time it was closer, peering from behind a tree. I froze. The figure stared at me with hollow, dark eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, paralyzed. Then, just as suddenly, it disappeared behind the tree. I ran back to Matt, breathless and panicked. I told him what I saw, but he tried to calm me down, suggesting it was just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. But I knew what I saw. That night, I hardly slept. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside our tent had me on edge. I kept seeing those dark, hollow eyes in my mind. By morning, I was exhausted, but I didn't want to ruin the trip for Matt, so I put on a brave face and we continued our hike. That was until our last night in the forest. We had set up camp again, and I stayed close to Matt the entire time. As we settled into the tent, I heard something moving outside. I sat up, listening intently as the noise grew louder. Matt was already asleep, so I quietly unzipped the tent slightly to peek outside. That's when I saw it. The same figure standing at the edge of the campsite, partially obscured by a tree. It was closer than before, its hollow eyes fixated on our tent. I saw more of it this time. It was tall, thin, and seemed to have elongated limbs. I quickly zipped the tent back up, my heart racing. I shook Matt awake, trying to explain through my fear what I saw. I insisted we needed to leave immediately. Sensing my genuine terror, Matt reluctantly agreed. We hastily packed up and started hiking through the dark, using our flashlights to guide us. I kept looking over my shoulder, dreading the sight of those hollow eyes following us. We hiked non-stop until dawn, when we finally reached the ranger station near Manistee. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as we stepped inside. Despite Matt's reassurances, I couldn't shake off the fear and anxiety. It wasn't until we were safely back home that I allowed myself to relax. When I shared my experience with a friend, they suggested it might have been a Hidebehind and told me more about the folklore. I had no idea such a thing even existed until then. Curious and desperate for answers, I started researching online about Hidebehinds. According to the website I stumbled upon, it is a creature from American folklore said to stalk forested areas, hiding behind trees and preying on those who dare to venture too deep into the woods. The description matched perfectly with what I saw. Stay safe out there, folks, and trust your instincts. I grew up in a small town in Northern California, surrounded by dense forests and mountains. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing much ever happened. That all changed one summer night when I was 17. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family because, honestly, who would believe me? But here it goes. It was late July, and a group of us from high school had decided to go camping in the woods a few miles outside of town. It was our last hurrah before senior year, and we wanted to make the most of it. There were 5 of us. Me, my best friends Mike and Sam, and our girlfriends, Lisa and Jenny. We packed up our tents, coolers, and flashlights and headed out late in the afternoon. We found a nice spot by a creek, set up camp and spent the day swimming, fishing, and just goofing around. As the sun set, we built a big campfire, roasted marshmallows, and told ghost stories. It was all fun and games, until around midnight, when things started to get strange. It started with the sounds. At first, they were faint, distant rustling, like something moving through the trees. We didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just the wind or some animal. But then, the noises grew louder and more deliberate. Branches snapping, footsteps crunching through the underbrush. It felt like we were being watched. Mike and I decided to take a look around, more out of curiosity than concern. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured out into the darkness, leaving the others by the fire. The woods were eerily quiet, aside from the occasional sound of something moving nearby. After a few minutes of searching and finding nothing, we decided to head back. As we were making our way back to the camp, we heard it. A low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. It was close. Too close. We froze, scanning the area with our flashlights. Then something caught my eye. A large, dark shape, moving about 50 feet away. A chill ran down my spine and my blood felt like it turned to ice. The beam of my flashlight landed on it for just a second, but it was enough to see that it was standing on 2 legs and covered in dark hair. Before I could say anything, Mike saw it too. His face went pale, and without a word, we both broke into a sprint. We didn't stop until we were back at the campsite, gasping for breath. The others could see the panic on our faces and knew something was wrong. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's something out there. Something big." Sam tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a bear. But Mike and I knew better. Bears don't stand on 2 legs, and they sure as hell don't stalk people like that. We started packing up, trying to keep calm, but the sense of urgency was palpable. As we were finishing up, the noises started again. Louder and more deliberate. Footsteps, heavy and measured, coming closer. We grabbed our gear and started to make our way back to the cars, sticking close together. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like we were being hunted. Then, just as we reached the road, we heard it. A deafening roar that echoed through the trees. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, primal and terrifying. We all broke into a run, not stopping until we reached the cars. We piled in and drove back to town as fast as we could, no one saying a word. When we finally got back to my house, We sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Lisa and Jenny were both crying, and even Sam looked shaken. "We're never going back there," Mike said finally, breaking the silence. We all nodded in agreement. It's been 10 years since that night, and I still think about it often. I've done a lot of research on Bigfoot since then, and I'm convinced that's what we encountered. Some people think it's just a myth, but I know what I saw. I've never been back to those woods, and I never will. Whatever is out there, it's better left alone. I just hope I never have to hear that roar again. Growing up in the Florida Panhandle, I heard all kinds of stories about the skunk ape, a local version of Bigfoot. People said it lived in the swamps and dense forests and could be recognized by its foul smell. Most folks laughed it off as just a myth or an old wives' tale. I was one of those people, until the summer of 2019. That summer, my cousin Jake and I decided to do some camping in the swamps near Apalachicola National Forest. We both loved fishing and figured a weekend away from civilization would do us good. We packed up our gear, loaded the boat, and headed deep into the backcountry. We found a spot to set up camp on a dry patch of land surrounded by cypress trees and thick underbrush. After setting up the tent and starting a fire, we spent the day fishing and exploring. As night fell, the air grew thick with the sounds of the swamp, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, and the occasional splash of something in the water. After a while, Jake mentioned smelling something horrible, like a mix of rotten eggs and skunk. I joked it was just a swamp gas, but soon enough I smelt it too. It was overpowering, making it hard to breathe. We tried to ignore it, thinking it would pass, but it only grew stronger. Around midnight, as we were sitting by the fire, we heard something moving through the brush. It was loud and heavy, definitely not a raccoon or a possum. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the darkness. The smell was almost unbearable now, and my nerves were on edge. Then, we saw it. Standing just at the edge of our campfire's light was a massive figure, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. Its eyes reflected the firelight, glowing eerily in the darkness. It just stood there, watching us. The stench was worse than ever, making my stomach turn. Jake and I were frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. The creature let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the air. And then, it stepped closer, its massive frame moving with a strange, almost fluid grace. I finally found my voice and whispered, "Jake, we need to get to the boat." He nodded, slowly, never taking his eyes off the creature. We began to back away, moving as slowly and quietly as possible. The skunk ape followed us with his gaze but didn't move. Every second felt like an eternity as we crept towards the water. When we were about 10 feet from the boat, the creature suddenly let out an ear-splitting scream and charged. That broke whatever spell we were under, and we bolted for the boat. In our panic, Jake tripped and fell, letting out a shout. I turned back to help him, and that's when I saw the creature stop, standing over him. For a moment, I was sure it was going to attack. But then, it just sniffed him, turned, and disappeared back into the swamp, leaving behind that awful smell. I helped Jake up, and we scrambled into the boat, nearly tipping it over in our haste. We didn't stop rowing until we reached the safety of the main river channel. Back at the dock, we sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Neither of us spoke about it to anyone else for fear of being ridiculed. But we both knew we had encountered the skunk ape. In the months that followed, I read everything I could about the creature. Sightings, stories, legends. It was all fascinating and terrifying. Most people dismiss it as a hoax or misidentification, but I know what I saw. The skunk ape is real, and it's out there, stalking the swamps of Florida. I still fish and camp, but I'm much more cautious now. I always stick closer to populated areas, and I never venture into the swamp without a good flashlight and a way to quickly get back to safety. Because no matter how beautiful and serene the wilderness might seem, there are things lurking in the shadows, things that remind us we are not alone. I've always loved hiking. There's just something about being out in nature that calms me. That all changed a few years ago during a weekend trip to the Pacific Northwest with my friends. I still have nightmares about it. It was late October, and the weather was perfect for a hike. Cool, crisp air and clear skies. We decided to head out to a lesser-known trail in the Cascade Range. We packed our gear, loaded up on snacks, and set off early in the morning. The first few hours were just what we expected. Breathtaking views, the scent of pine, and the sound of leaves crunching under our boots. Around midday, we stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail that wasn't on our map. Being the adventurous type, we decided to follow it. The path led us deeper into the forest, away from the well-traveled routes. After about an hour, the trail opened up into a small clearing, and that's when things started to get weird. First, it was the silence. The usual forest sounds, birds chirping, squirrels rustling, they were gone. My buddy Dave pointed it out, asking jokingly if we'd entered some kind of no animal zone. We laughed it off, but the silence was unsettling. Then we noticed the smell. It was this foul, almost sewage-like odor, like something rotting. We couldn't figure out where it was coming from, and we quickly debated turning back. But our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to push on. About 20 minutes later, we found something that nearly stopped my heart. There, in the soft earth of the trail, were enormous footprints. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, easily twice the size of my boot, with a distinct 5-toe pattern. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe someone was playing a prank with fake footprints. But they were too deep and too real. We gathered around, speculating what could have made them. Dave, always a skeptic, started to make fun of us seeing Bigfoot, but none of us were laughing. The prints were fresh, and from the way they indented the soil, whatever made them was heavy. We decided to keep moving, not because we wanted to, but because staying there suddenly felt wrong. As we continued, that sickening odor grew stronger, making it hard to breathe. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, unlike any animal I'd ever heard. It echoed through the trees, freezing us in our tracks. Dave's face went pale. None of us dared to speak. The growl came again, this time closer, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. We started to backtrack slowly, hoping to retrace our steps without provoking what was out there. But we were too late. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something big, really big, was moving through the trees, keeping pace with us. It was just a shadow, but I could make out the shape of long, muscular limbs, moving with a terrifying grace. Suddenly, there was a loud crashing sound as the creature stepped on a fallen tree branch. That was it. Instinct took over, and we ran like our lives depended on it. Which, in hindsight, they probably did. I don't think I've ever been that scared in my life. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail, gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. We looked back, but there was no sign of the creature. The smell was gone and the forest sounds had slowly returned. We didn't say much after that. We just wanted to get out of there. That night we sat around the campfire, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Dave was unusually quiet. He finally broke the silence, saying, "Maybe there's more out there than we know." We all nodded in agreement. Since that day, I've never been back to the Cascades. I still love hiking, but now I stick to well-traveled trails. And every time I hear a strange noise in the forest, I wonder if it's out there watching me. Walking in those woods that day felt like we stepped into another world, one where humans didn't belong. I'm not sure what we encountered that day, but I know one thing's for sure. I'm not eager to meet it ever again. I've lived in South Florida my whole life, and I've spent more weekends than I can count out in the Everglades camping, fishing, and hiking. It's this love for the outdoors that led me to an unforgettable experience 2 summers ago. I'm not a very good writer, but I need to get this story out there. It was June 2018, one of those sticky hot Florida nights. My buddies and I decided to do some night fishing in a remote area we hadn't been to before. We paddled our canoes deep into the swamp, further than usual, hoping for a good catch. By about midnight, we hadn't had much luck, but the quiet of the night and the occasional splash of a turtle or gator made it worth it. Then, something changed. The usual sounds of the swamp seemed to just stop. No frogs, no insects, nothing. It was eerily silent. We started to smell it before we saw anything. A rank, overpowering odor, like a mix of skunk and wet dog. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I joked about it being the biggest gator fart ever, but inside, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. As we kept fishing, we heard something moving in a brush nearby. It sounded heavy, way heavier than a deer or even an alligator. We shined our flashlights towards the noise but saw nothing. The smell grew stronger, almost unbearable, and my buddy Mike joked about the swamp monster coming to get us. But his laughter was nervous. I was about to dismiss the whole thing when I saw it. Across the small channel from us, just inside the tree line, stood a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, and covered in dark, matted hair. Its eyes reflected our flashlight beams with an eerie yellow glow. I couldn't believe my eyes. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. Mike whispered, "What the hell is that?" We were all frozen, just staring. The creature took a step closer, and we could hear the branches snapping under its weight. It didn't seem aggressive, but it let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. We didn't dare move. The smell was almost making me gag at this point. after what it felt like forever, but was probably just a minute or two, it turned and disappeared into the trees. We sat there in a stunned silence before practically throwing our gear into the canoes and paddling back to the dock as fast as we could. When we got back, none of us knew what to say. We just stood there, still reeling from what we'd seen. Mike finally broke the silence. "That had to be the skunk ape," he said, voice unsteady. We all nodded, not knowing what else it could have been. I've told a few people about that night, but most just laugh it off or think we were drunk. We weren't. Whatever we saw, it was real, and it was terrifying. I haven't been back to that part of the glade since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. I've read more about skunk ape sightings since then, and while there's a lot of skepticism, I know what we saw. The Everglades hold a lot of mysteries, and not all of them are friendly. If you're ever out there and start smelling something foul, it might be best to pack up and just head home. Stay safe out there. I've been hunting all my life. It's something my dad taught me, and his dad taught him. Living in the backcountry of Montana, you grow up with a rifle in your hands and the wilderness as your backyard. There's a peace you find in the solitude of the forest, but sometimes solitude can become something much darker. A few years ago, during the late fall season, I decided to go hunting for elk. The cold air was just starting to bite, and the early snow had scared off most city folks, leaving the forest to seasoned hunters like me. I packed my gear, loaded my rifle, and set off before dawn, aiming to be deep in the woods by sunrise. I reached my favorite spot, a secluded part of the forest with a small clearing that elk frequently passed through. I settled down, blending in with the surroundings, and waited. The hours ticked by, the forest waking up around me. I spotted a few deer, but nothing that I was interested in. Around midday, the forest grew unnaturally still. The usual sounds, birds, insects, they just stopped. I've experienced this kind of silence before, and it usually meant a predator was nearby. I figured it might be a wolf or a mountain lion. Staying alert, I scanned the trees, my hand resting on my rifle. Minutes later, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was a bear, given its size. But as it moved closer, I realized it was walking on two legs. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. My heart raced and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. For a moment I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. The creature was sniffing the air, clearly aware of my presence but not directly looking at me. Its arms, long and muscular, hung low, swinging slightly as it moved. I have never felt so small, so vulnerable. In all my years of hunting, I have never seen anything like this. I slowly raised my rifle, not to shoot, but to use the scope for a closer look. The creature's face came into focus, a mix of human and ape, with deep-set eyes that seemed almost intelligent. It let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through my chest. That's when it turned its head and looked directly at me. Those eyes, they were filled with a wildness, but also a strange curiosity. I didn't dare move. The creature just stared at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, as if deciding I wasn't a threat, it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. I stayed in my spot for another hour, too shocked and shaken to do anything. But when I finally packed up and started the trek back to my truck, my mind was racing. Had I really just seen Bigfoot? If I hadn't been so shaken, I would have questioned my sanity. But I knew what I saw. Back home, I told my dad about it. He listened quietly, then nodded. "You saw the old man of the woods," he said, using the old folk name. Turns out, sightings weren't as uncommon as I thought. In our family, it was something of a rite of passage, though rarely spoken of. I've returned to that spot many times since, but I've never seen the creature again. I don't feel the fear I did that day, more a sense of respect for something ancient and wild that roams those woods. And though I still hunt, I've come to realize that there are things out there that aren't meant to be understood or disturbed. Sometimes, it's best to leave the mysteries of the forest just as they are. I don't usually post stuff like this, but I need to share what happened to me last summer. It was August 2022, and I decided to spend the weekend camping in Big Cypress National Preserve. I'd been camping there a few times and always loved it. The solitude, the nature, the break from city life. I picked a spot that was pretty remote, off a trail that I'd heard about from a buddy. The first night was uneventful. Typical sounds of the swamp, frogs, crickets, some night birds. I woke up early, spent the day hiking and taking pictures, and got back to my camp just before dark. I had a quick dinner, then settled by the fire, enjoying the stillness. Around 10 p.m., things started getting weird. First, the usual night sounds just stopped. It was like someone hit the mute button. No frogs, no insects, nothing. I tried to brush it off, but it made me feel really uneasy. Then, I smelt it. This awful, overpowering stench like a mix of garbage and skunk. It was so strong I had to cover my nose. I thought maybe something had died nearby and was decomposing, but as I walked around the perimeter of my camp, the smell only got worse. And then I heard it. This rustling sound, coming from the trees. It was heavy, deliberate. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but couldn't see anything. That's when I saw them. These glowing eyes reflecting back at me from just beyond the tree line. They were high up too, like 6 or 7 feet off the ground. My heart started pounding and I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a deer or something? But I knew deep down that that wasn't right. Suddenly, the creature stepped into the light. It was massive, covered in dark matted hair, and walked upright like a man. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. I froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My first thought was, is this a bear standing on its hind legs? But the more I looked, the more I realized this was something different. The creature let out this low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my whole body. The smell was seriously making me nauseous at this point. My fight or flight instincts were kicking in, but I felt glued to the spot. After a few agonizing moments, it turned and disappeared back into the trees, moving quickly and quietly despite its size. I stood there for a good minute before I had the sense to grab my things. I threw my gear into my pack way faster than I should have, but I needed to get out of there. I hiked back to my car, flashlight in hand, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every rustle had me jumping out of my skin. I don't know how I managed to make it back without running into God knows what else. By the time I reached the car, I was drenched in sweat and breathing hard. I drove straight home, didn't breathe easy until I was miles away from the preserve. I've told a few close friends about what happened, but most just laugh it off or think I'm pulling their leg. I wish I was. I've read about skunk ape sightings in Florida. Always thought they were just a local legend. Now, I'm not so sure. Whatever I saw that night, it was real, and it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen before. Stay safe out there, folks. If you're ever in Big Cypress and you start smelling something awful, be on high alert. There's definitely something out there. My friends and I saw one the night I'm writing this, in the later hours of November 30th and the early morning of December 1st, 2024. We live in southern Arizona and are all staying the night at one friend's house for a birthday party. Her house is known between us all as the haunted house since we're always experiencing weird things there. But this time, right after the sun had set, we were sitting on the porch in the backyard when one of us yelled and pointed at the chest-high brick fence, saying that she just saw a bald, white human head poke itself over the fence. Two of us immediately ran over and looked over the fence to see nothing. We laughed that off, but it was the first sighting of the night. We hung out outside a little longer until we decided to check over the fence again. And while we were doing so, we heard scuttering on the outside of the fence out of view. We joked about it and just went inside instead. Skip to a while later, we went outside again and almost right away, someone saw a head pop up around another fence. Again, we all thought it was nothing, but more of us started seeing a head, hands, and part of a back. At that point, we were scared as hell and started going back inside when one friend stayed back and scared the hell out of us, but she was just standing and looking. We stayed there for a while, now with one friend holding a broom. They lost their broom privileges soon after, and we kept seeing small things of white, and some of the same things from before. Our other friend, previously inside, came out again, which made us all jump, and we all started talking about things we saw and what it could be when we kept seeing things. Eventually, two people heard a growling, and it was very clear. They both weren't faking, and we all ran inside and started panicking, trying to reason with the fact there was a skinny, bald white man crawling outside. We eventually found this, and thank goodness, because, believe it or not, it made us all feel better. This was our story, believe it or not. Do you think it's real? Or are we just crazy teenagers? Anyone ever encounter anything reptilian-like in western North Carolina? The caves are everywhere here in Appalachia. My husband has encountered one years ago and interacted with him. My boyfriend experienced something very strange, and I'm reaching out here to see if anyone else has ever experienced anything similar. This occurred in northwestern North Carolina in 2012. He and his partner at the time were sleeping in bed. They were in a bedroom that had French doors that opened to the backyard, facing a large piece of property, 7 acres, with a stream that comes straight out of the mountain from an aquifer. He awoke randomly and saw 2 red eyes pass by the window of the French doors at somewhere near to 7 to 8 foot off the ground. The door opened as a very intense vibration started, and he sat up to scream and could not hear himself yelling. He could see his cat on the edge of the bed hissing. His partner didn't stir. The vibration caused him to fall back and he passed out. He woke up face down on the bed with his head turned towards the edge of the mattress. He was unable to move. A figure rose and was completely out of focus a few inches from his face, almost like it was camouflaged. He states its motion was so unnaturally fluid. He could see his surroundings but could not focus on the creature. He explains it as if the creature was out of focus in a photograph. He then unfocused his eyes and used his peripheral vision and was able to see the creature clearly. He states it had brown-green coloring with scales and a worn, pockmarked face, bright red eyes that glowed. When he saw the creature and was able to really decipher what he was looking at, it opened a very large mouth and gave him a gigantic, toothy smile. He says he felt its energy, that it was amused at him for figuring out how to see it. The vibration began again as he watched the creature sink back out of view below the edge of the mattress before passing back out from the frequencies. He awoke several hours later and his partner had no idea anything had occurred. He said the entire time he felt no emotion, no fear, no anger, nothing. He says he knows something violent happened to him and he thinks they wanted to take him but didn't. He had rows of red dots across his back and states it looked like he had laid on a bed of nails. His partner at the time saw the markings as well. He assumes this type of humanoid creature came from underground and travels or lives through the cave systems here. We know there's got to be some sort of opening in the land where the aquifer exits and the water flows down the property. This is his father's property, about 10 acres. We live across the street and I lock my doors out of paranoia now. The correlation between missing persons around cave systems is unsettling, and I wonder if this has anything to do with it. Any similar experiences? Years later in 2024, I laugh and cry at the fact that I now live in the house this happened in. Hello, long-time lurker in here. This happened back in 2009 in Puerto Rico, and we still don't know what it was. So back in 2009, 4 friends and I were walking home from a basketball game in a suburb that is near our neighborhood. It was around 8 p.m. and it was pretty dark. There were 2 ways to get into my neighborhood. The first one was the shortcut, which consisted of cutting through the middle of an abandoned paintball park in an open field, and it would take about 10 minutes to arrive at our homes. Second was the long way, which takes about 25 to 30 minutes, walking in a brightly lit area surrounded by houses and endless illuminated roads that finished right on the entrance of the abandoned park, and then 5 minutes of walking in semi-illuminated areas. We took the shortcut like we did every time, but this time everything was quiet. No animal sounds, no car sounds, just pure silence. One of my friends decides to start talking about how it must be cool to play with a Ouija in the middle of the field as a joke. We tell him to shut up collectively because we were pretty scared. We all see the entrance of the park and we start getting stressed and start talking again. We were about 100 feet from the entrance when we all hear and feel stomps coming from behind us, but not regular stomps, but heavy stomps, like an elephant or a bull running. We looked back and there was this strange shaped creature with really dim red eyes. At first, it looked completely dark, but as it got closer, it was grayish and charging towards us. We collectively looked at each other and we ran as fast as possible towards the entrance and managed to get out. While walking, there is a part of the street that briefly overlooks the field, and we all looked to see if we could see anything, but all we could see was dim red dots looking directly at us. We all went home and the next day tried to figure out what had happened. 4 out of the 5 of us can confirm this story. Sadly, one of my friends passed away a couple of years ago. I also moved, but have to travel every weekend through that area to visit my family. It still gives me the creeps going through there at night. I wanted to share a truly bizarre, terrifying, and unexplainable experience I had growing up. To make note, my childhood home was a hotbed for paranormal activity. I could honestly write a book with the amount of stories I have, but this one was different from all the rest. To start off, we lived on a small stretch of secluded highway in a wooded area. Our home was nestled on a plot of land that was a few acres, and the area surrounding us was federally protected land of the Wildlife Refuge, which means unless your house is grandfathered in, then no one can purchase land or build in this area, so we had no neighbors. Our house was a 300-year-old colonial house and held a bit of history. There was knowledge of Native Americans once residing there and a lot of war stories, with the Civil and Revolutionary War happening on that land. There was definitely a heavy negative energy in that house and property. You always felt like you were being watched from every angle of the woods, and so many people who visited would become uneasy immediately and state their discomfort in needing to leave. My family and I have countless stories we experienced individually or with one another. This particular experience was shared between myself and 2 brothers. So, like many nights after dinner, my dad would tell me, or one of my brothers, to go out back and feed the dog. This was a scary task because it would be pitch black and our dog would be near the tree line of woods, which, for some reason, that section of woods would give us all an uneasy feeling any time we went near it. And it didn't matter the time of day, it was always creepy. But being at night was definitely terrifying. So no matter which one of us was told to go out and feed the dog, we would never leave a man behind and would always go out in a trio because we knew better than that, because we wouldn't want to be left to go alone when it came for our turn. So on this particular night, I was probably around 11 years old, my brothers being 10 and the other 7. We would always do the same thing. So whoever was told by Dad to feed the dog, they were the one who had to carry the bowl out, and the other 2 would huddle close with the person with the bowl in the middle. We would walk extremely slow, all of us looking in different directions, surveying the property, but keeping the conversations very light-hearted and being silly to keep from getting scared before completing the task. Once we reached our dog, this is where the person holding the bowl would get screwed, because right before you had the chance to put it down, the other 2 siblings would scream something scary like Jeepers Creepers or the Jersey Devil, while hauling their ass back to the house. So you would be left standing alone before getting the chance to run with your siblings. So on this night, my brother was the one who had to hold the bowl, and as we walked out to head towards the backyard, something felt off, like the air felt static and charged, like how it feels before a lightning storm. We could hear our dog barking like crazy, which was unusual, and as we got into sight of our dog, we see him standing on his hind legs, with a leash pulled completely tight, because whatever he was barking at, he was trying with all he had to break out from the collar and go after it. That's when we heard loud branches snapping and looked towards the direction our dog was barking in. We then see this giant, black stick figure that was as tall as the trees. It was walking over this huge brush pile we had, which was why we were hearing branches breaking. The way it walked was almost mechanical in a way, and its presence felt very ominous and gave us a very dreadful feeling. At first, it seemed like it didn't notice us and was just walking by, but then it turned towards us, and that's when we booked it for the house, my brother throwing the bowl of food in the air and feeling like our legs were jello. We all saw the same thing, and it scared us so badly. Unlike many stories you hear, my parents actually believed us. Anyway, fast forward years and years later, and I was having a conversation with my co-worker. We would talk about paranormal topics quite a bit. So during this conversation, she asked me if I had ever heard of the Native American stick people. And as soon as she said it, I knew what she was referring to. She then tells me about these giant stick figures out in the woods that Native Americans have seen and are supposedly a totem of evil spirits. And if you encounter one and it goes after you, it can then possess you and cause you to do harm. I was freaked out because up until then, I'd never heard of such a thing. But knowing the Native American history of that land, it makes me believe that they are related. It's been 10 years since this happened, but the event is something that stuck with me, and I want to share. In 2014, I was sent to a summer camp to study German near the Munich Alps. The location was remote. The only way out was a bus stop on the other side of a lake, located near a hotel and an abandoned church, the only other buildings there. The Wi-Fi at the time was really in its infancy at the camp, while mobile signals would come and go. Typically, you would have half a bar, and, if lucky, one bar. The camp was surrounded by mountains, and if you wanted to get out by foot, you had to hike upwards and then hike 15 to 20 kilometers through the thicket. The weather would change considerably quickly, from rain to fog to clear blue. The summer camp had 6 staff members for a group of 30 students, ranging in age from 13 to 17. I was 14 at the time and was lucky with the group I had. I surrounded myself with a few Americans, Australians, and Russians who were good company, but I lost contact over the years. There were French and mostly Spanish students. The majority of my time there was amazing, hiking for 8 to 9 hours through the mountains, swimming in the lake, and making campfires, shooting bows, playing ball. It was the best summer of my life. Skipping to week 2, to the event which would change the way I looked at the place, even up to today. It was a very dreadful day from that morning, as the rain was heavy and the wind was blowing the fog into the valley. It was max 10 degrees, maybe 11, but I still can't believe we continued hiking in those conditions. No one was against it. The hike was miserable as we walked up in elevation, but it all went well until the descent, when the staff members told us we couldn't continue the hike and needed to go back. During the descent, I started to get this sickening feeling of being watched, but it eventually disappeared after we got back to camp. Once in camp, I was talking to one of the guys in my room about it, but he shrugged it off and said, "You probably just caught a cold or something." As time went on, the rain finally stopped, and we were all gathering to start a campfire around 5 to 6 p.m. All was good, and everyone was enjoying themselves. One of the guys, Mike, brought out his large lumen flashlight, which lit up the forest tree line to the right side of the camp. At this time, the fog started to flood the camp and the lake, but no one really cared as it looked cool from what I remembered. Some were running into the distance and back for photos. I asked Mike if I could borrow his light. A few minutes went by while moving the light from right to left. I jokingly muttered, "Imagine if something jumped out of the woods." As I flashed the light to my left, a white figure silhouette was walking towards the woodline. I shouted, "Mike, look, you see that?" To my horror, he had already started shouting for everyone to look. As everyone in the courtyard looked, the figure stopped and turned its head, revealing its yellow, glowing eyes. I couldn't tell whether it was eyeshine from the light or its own glow. Its arms were long, super long, similar to an ape, going down to knee level. The overall appearance was muscular, but athletically slim. The face I couldn't make out from the distance of 40 meters. It then started walking again, as a staff member ran to get others as his phone didn't work. All of this happened within a few seconds. As this was happening, the creature looked back at the forest and ran uphill. The speed at which it ran would make a deer look slow. It was fast, a rough estimate of 40 to 50 miles per hour. It could have easily taken out all of us and then gotten into the building. As this happened, the staff members arrived and huddled us inside, telling us to lock all doors and windows and to stay indoors after 6 p.m. The time I imagine was at this point 8:30 to 9 p.m., roughly speaking. We huddled in our rooms as each member did a room check of everyone who should be inside. The night was long as half the camp started to discuss what we saw and puzzle it together. There were noises on the roof and tapping throughout the night, but we didn't see anything as it was pitch darkness. The following morning came and the courtyard was covered in small rocks and sticks thrown about. The big changes were in the weekly timetable. The hikes were all either shortened or completely cancelled. The staff then held a large meeting to announce that we couldn't go outside a certain radius of the camp as we did before, and we needed to be in groups of 6 to be outside. After that, even when going out and walking around, everything felt off, and the world seemed a lot more hostile than what I had experienced 2 weeks ago. Some cut the camp short and went home. Others waited for the week to end. I left that following week, even when my mum wanted me to stay an extra week, which I declined. Moving to a year later, I revisited the camp for 2 weeks as I enjoyed my initial time up until the event. Also, it was a good language school. Once I arrived, I noticed they had built an electrical fence around the whole perimeter of the camp. I was unfortunate enough to get shocked accidentally by it several times, as it would turn on during the evening to early hours and turn off during the day. The staff said it's to keep the cows at bay, which I had never seen walking in that area before and during this time. The time to go indoors was 7 p.m, no longer 9 or 10 p.m. like last year. Cameras were installed around the area. The groups were still a thing. Things were getting stricter and more alert, but those 2 weeks went by without much happening. If there are questions, I would be happy to answer. Sorry for the long build-up, and apologies for the grammatical mistakes. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you all so much for listening. If you have a story you'd like to share with the channel, please send it to my email, which will be found in the description below. If you'd like to support the channel, consider signing up for my Patreon, which you can watch my videos ad-free and usually with bonus stories, as well as other perks depending on the level. This year, I will be redesigning my merch store, so keep an eye out for that one. And as always, the biggest thank you is to all of you. I truly appreciate all of your support over the last couple of years. And remember,
Papa loves you.